At the time, there was some opportunity to have some publicity about some other issue. And so my mother got really afraid that the whole world would then know her daughter's lesbian. So then she told me not to do it. And we had a massive fight about it, about many things. I think it was just bubbling up. Asian pressure of family stuff just exploded. From that point on, I didn't speak to my mother or my brother for close to 10 years.
We're joined today by economist, advisor, global speaker and founder of Australia's first AI-powered market research agency called Maven Data, and has spent the past 20 years advising government, academia, SMEs and ASX 10 companies on future trends. She's been able to scarily and accurately predict the most recent federal election, the rise of Greta Thunberg, COVID vaccine hesitancy, the 2020 US election, and has even predicted the winners of The Voice for the last 3 years, as well as Masterchef Australia 2020, just for fun. She also has a long list of accolades, featuring and being quoted on major news and media platforms such as The Guardian, SBS, Daily Mail, Australian Financial Review, Business Insider, Channel 7, 9 and 10, just to name a few. She holds a degree in economics, commerce and postgraduate finance from the University of Queensland, and she's also a mother of twin girls now living in Sydney. We're excited to have Elisa, the data whisperer Choy, on the show. Elisa, welcome to the Level Asian podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
I was going to say, Elisa, my first exposure to you was seeing you on the Today Show. That was the very first time, and I was like super excited. And I was like, wow, like not only an Asian, but Asian female on TV, which is also sort of sad, but great to also see, I guess. And like Viv mentioned, how accurately, I guess, you predicted the federal election as well. So with that all said, and you being in big data and AI, how did you first get into big data and AI?
First get into? Well, I've always been in data. It's always been numerate and always been analytical. So in my 20-year career, I've had I started in finance and analysing companies and financial modelling, which is the old school version of coding in Excel. But it was about, I think, 5 years or more than 5 years ago when I had a job at Caltex, which is now Ampol, and they were setting up a data and analytics centre of excellence, as all companies were. And so they were sucking in data scientists and data engineers from wherever. And at the time, there weren't that many around. So they got, the PhDs in maths and physics guys, right, who couldn't speak English but could do lots of really good numbers and coding. So I joined the team as a data strategist. And just prior to that, I remember lying in bed thinking to myself, I want to be the queen of data and I want to understand what drives people to make decisions. And so I took a short course with General Assembly in data analytics. And then I was like, oh my goodness, if I was born again 10 years earlier, then I would be a data scientist, right? So I took sort of my analytical brain, my number crunching, my curiosity to understand the world. I did that short course and I got a job at Caltex. I was a data strategist then. So that was then working in big data. They've got so much data every single day. Millions of people transact across the network, right? And I got an opportunity to work with true data scientists and true data engineers, and it's a different culture, working across the business, scoping assignments and then translating the output, program managing it, all that stuff. So that I would say would be my first introduction to the world of big data. But the AI element came much later. So when I eventually left corporate, I decided to start my own because it was time. And so I started a business and I came across a technology that is an AI technology. And I had a look at that and I thought, wow, this is something that I could take to market. So what we've done for many, many years was working with it to understand how it works, the applications. And so that's why I started off with, predicting The Voice or predicting Masterchef. And then someone asked me, can you predict elections? I was like, oh, I don't think I can. And then I had a go and it's like, oh, okay. And so it just became this journey of curiosity. And so, Maven Data now is the world's first AI-powered strategic market research company. And so I think right now where I am in my career and my life, I think I get to draw on all my experience from the last 20 plus years, from work. So that was my introduction to big data and AI.
Yeah. Have you always had that spark in you when you were younger though? Where did you kind of find that interest as well?
The spark?
Yeah.
Which
go
spark?
down.
Oh, so many sparks. so many sparks.
Have you always been interested in data and going into this field when you were younger?
Well, I think we didn't know what the word data meant,
Yeah.
right? However, if I was to sort of analyze what I spent my time doing in my spare time, I loved Sudoku. I loved puzzles. I loved, those puzzles where you got to like with the tiles, you got to like arrange them so it becomes 1, 2, 3, 4, all to 12, right? Used to get them on planes when they used to give toys like that, right?
Yep.
I used to sit there. I loved that stuff. So figuring things out. And I always had a spark and a curiosity. I was that annoying child. Why? But why? But why?
Drive your mum mad.
Drive my mother mad. Well, my children have it now too, and I welcome that. So I've always had that curiosity and the spark and the drive. And it's funny, not too long ago, I reconnected with my grade 7 primary school teacher, Mr. Lowe from Brisbane. I don't know why I felt like I needed to call him. I didn't speak to him for 30 years. So on the day of the election, the Australian election, my predictions went out. I was really anxious. I was like, oh my goodness, if I bomb, this is going to be the worst ever.
This will make or break your career.
Right? I'd have to just spin it in some way. So I was really sort of just at that vulnerable point where I had this thought, maybe I should contact my grade 7 teacher who I haven't spoken to for 30 years.
Yes, why not?
So I looked him up and then he emailed me straight away when I pinged him, and then we had a chat for about an hour and a half. Wow. And then he said to me, he said, Elisa, you've always had that go-getter attitude, the spark. And he said, I remember you specifically saying one day when some boys were giving you some trouble at school, you said to me, Mr. Lowe, I can do anything.
Nice.
And you didn't do anything.
I didn't realise I had that in me. Still, like I don't remember, but he remembered. And so I guess I've always had that spark.
I'd like to wind it all the way back. We're talking like baby Elisa Choy.
In the uterus?
Yeah, in the uterus. Well, maybe not that early, but a little bit further down the track. You said you grew up in Hong Kong. So can you tell us at what age did you spend your time in Hong Kong before coming to Australia, and what were the circumstances for your family deciding to come?
My brother and I were born in Hong Kong in the 80s. You can do the maths.
Still young.
Still young. And at the time, my mother was running a jewelry store in a hotel. And so from a very young age, I was always helping her. So my brother was in the back room as a baby, crying and sleeping and all that. And I was in the front at the shop. And so, with my little bob haircut, by the age of 3 and 4, I'd be, standing on a little stool next to the counter and greeting customers, and they're always tourists, etc. So I was always beside my mother, and she was always a business owner, right? So, and then she met one of her customers one day, and he eventually became my stepfather. So he was a Czechoslovakian man. This is how old it is, when it was Czechoslovakia.
Before it split,
Before it was split. And he took a shining to her, and she took a shining to him. And by that time, my mother had separated from my biological father because the story is that, he didn't treat her very nicely. There was domestic violence in that story. And so basically by the time my brother was born, at the age of 1, they had separated. So my mother was on her own. And so when she met this gentleman, he lived in Australia. And so they courted for a little bit. And then to cut a long story short, she decided to migrate to Australia, not speaking a word of English, taking her 2 young children with her, moving to Adelaide.
Romantic. Adelaide. Okay, I should have let you finish that sentence first. Wow.
Adelaide.
So Adelaide was first before Brisbane?
Yes, it was Adelaide. And it was, in the 80s. And there weren't many Asians, particularly in Adelaide. I remember my brother and I were the only Asians in the whole school, bar one Vietnamese kid. One. And so, there was a lot of racism then. And but also too, like eventually we moved from Adelaide to Brisbane because we did a road trip. We did a 2-week drive. And she realised it was just a lot more happening in Brisbane. Also, the temperature and the climate was better, not so cold. And so we had some friends over in Brisbane, so we sort of moved north. So we grew up in Sunnybank.
There we go.
Of course.
Okay. And then when did you come down to Sydney?
So when I finished my degrees at University of Queensland, and I studied financing degrees in economics, all of us wanted to be investment bankers because that's where the money was.
It is, yeah.
And there were no jobs in investment banking back then. This is like in the early 2000s. So you had to go to Sydney. So we all migrated. And a lot of them are still here. A lot of them have moved back. So my start into the world of corporate was actually did an internship at JP Morgan. And at the time, I was selected as one of 5 in the country. And this was a time before Macquarie Bank, before Citigroup, before Deutsche, before all these. So you only had about a handful of banks servicing this market. Now there's like 15 banks, just overbanked. But back then it was really, really tough. And I was one of 5 and I was the only female. So I was very excited. I got, flown up to Sydney and they put you up for 10 weeks in an apartment. You felt very big and adult-like. And they gave you a salary, which was $55,000 at the time, but it was awesome. And so, I remember it was the lull before the M&A boom. And so it was so boring. All I did was research and it was just like PowerPoint shit and, sorry. It was
you can
like,
swear. It's okay.
It was like, is this what investment banking is all about? So much glory, working late hours, eating meals I give you. So I kind of just, I didn't really like it and I ended up starting in PwC. So it was, and I did the move up from Brisbane to Sydney because of work. And I've stayed here since.
And I suppose, at least in my perception, because I'm not in investment banking, but certainly got a lot of friends in that, Asians, but it does strike me as very male-centric as well. Was that the case when you were going through, JP Morgan and that as well?
Yep.
So how did you navigate that? Did you or did you
need
to?
It just is. Like there's nothing you can do about it. All industries were male dominated, to be honest. Like give me one industry back then that wasn't male dominated. It didn't bother me at all. I don't think I got treated differently. I just don't know what I don't know because, boys will have their conversations. Of course. You just don't know. But also, I mean, I have to admit being female in a male dominated industry, like finance, there was a lot of sexual harassment. There was a lot of, just off the cuff,
Schneid comments,
mean comments that were degrading to women. And it puts you in a position where, you don't know how to react because, you don't want to stand out. So early in the career, I joke about how females enter the workforce and, they're young, they don't know very much and they become, like prey for sexual harassment. Could be a side touch here or a comment here or innuendo here, all the way through to, sexual relations, like stuff like that. So we all had to navigate that. No one ever taught us what to do. And some of us, I would say, things happened to us that we never told anybody. Right? And you never will. Right? And it's happened to me a few times, like not to big extent, but just incidences. I'm like,
it stays with you.
It stays with you. And you sort of like, how do you navigate that? I don't know. I just kind of did. Like I wouldn't be, I'd like to replay that back now and have an avenue where people can feel comfortable to navigate it together in the safety of people you trust. Because back then it's like, who do you talk to? Like your manager who's a man or, and if your boss is doing something to you, like, who do you talk to? Like, it's just so hard. It's really difficult.
Way too many options, right?
Right. So, at the start of your career as a female, you get harassed sexually and then, you get to your 30s and you get to know a little bit more about stuff and you're a bit more confident and capable and then you become a threat and then you become bullied.
Yes.
So no longer a piece of meat. You are a target for bullying, which is what I also experienced. It's a minefield that only females have the pleasure and the honour of experiencing and navigating, which is why I think when it comes to leadership, with women that we just have a different level of approach and empathy towards situations that you just can't get unless you're a female. So I think I'd like to see more and more females rise through the ranks. But I always say the females that are not male females, right?
The alpha you're talking about?
Well, you can be alpha. Like, what does alpha even mean? You know, what's strong, confident, or is it termed aggressive and bitchy? Like, you know, there's so many double standards in essentially the same characteristics in a male or a female. It's just different, you know, shades of the same thing. So I think what I mean by male females is like, well, when I was working at Caltex, which is an engineering company basically in fuel and oil, right? Very male dominated. The women that were at the top or, you know, towards the top, they were like men. Like they dressed like men, acted like men, talked like men. They had no feminine essence about them. And so I didn't look to them and go, oh, I want to be like that, because I'm not like that. So just because you're gender female doesn't mean you're female sometimes. So I think I'd like to see more, you know, females.
Best way to describe it, isn't it?
You're allowed to step into the feminine side of yourself rather than having to step and keep on that masculine
pretend to
side.
be a man. And I used to think that those women got in because they were like men.
Yeah.
You know, so the men accepted them. Whereas now it's like, no, I think it's a bit of learning about how we appreciate each other's differences. And I don't actually think that we should focus on equality as the main thing. It's not about equality between man and woman. It's about equilibrium, not equality.
So if I'm understanding that correctly, you're saying it's everyone should have a fair shot at what it is that they're trying to strive for in that case, meaning it's more of a meritocracy as opposed to saying you have to have a ratio or 50-50 or whatever that case is, or what does that mean by equilibrium?
The ratio thing is hard because without a hard ratio, it won't happen. Like without a 2030 net zero target, things don't change. So at some point you need to force the issue, right? But when it comes to things like appreciating each other's differences, I look at it like a menagerie, like a jungle. Every animal has got its own qualities and they bring to the ecosystem different things.
Right.
You don't tell an elephant to swim. You don't tell a goldfish to climb a tree, right? So you take everybody's contributions and you honour that and you nurture that. And so together you produce a harmonious equilibrium ecosystem.
Right. Okay. So there's an interdependence, you know, because you're leaning into what each role that they have in a broader sort of system or ecosystem in that case.
We're all born with innate talents and gifts. You know, some people find it, some people never find it. Some people try to fit themselves into a particular box for whatever reason, and then they find they're just out of sync. They don't ever feel happy and settled, right? And those who actually get alignment and understand why they're on earth and what they're doing is what they're doing, it's just an easier life. Now that's getting more into a little bit more spiritual side of things, which I think people are sort of awakening to as well.
What kind of shift would we expect to see with more women in leadership in our world?
I think there would be less war. There will be more conversation and acceptance. There will be less selfishness. There will be more community-orientated endeavours. Just put it this way, like, you know, last year there was some stat that was saying the top 5 tech companies, like these tech billionaires, together spent $260 billion US on green shoot projects, like shooting rockets to Mars, to the moon. And you're like, well, with $260 billion US, you can solve a lot of the world's problems tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Right? And so, you know, you look at, for example, Amazon, Jeff Bezos, he's divorced his wife. Even Bill Gates divorced they're divorced. The women, what do they do with their money that they got from the settlement? Investing, giving away, all that. There's not enough money to give away. That's what women do.
And whilst ego stroke for the males.
Not all men are like that. But, you know, when you're talking alpha male, it's like all about themselves, right? So you can't evolve a society when it's also singular. You know, it's always, I heard someone say, a coach said one time, you're better off having a champion team than a team of champions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big sports head and that's the adage, right? But I think I always use sports analogies, and Viv knows this because whenever we have team meetings, I'm always using sport. They probably have no idea what I'm talking about. But I think it's very much true. We talk about, even offense and defense. You talk about, team of, champions instead of champion team, or vice versa. I got that around the wrong way. But it's very true because you can't just be the one person that does it on its own, because you are only just one, as you said, right?
It's a team effort.
Yeah.
It's just like, I'm from Queensland, so I followed the Maroons with State of Origin. And why did they win 9 years straight? The New South Wales team just has just as talented, just as brilliant, highly skilled players, but there was something about their team dynamics that made them a champion team.
Yeah.
Whereas for a while, the New South Wales boys, they were all a team of champions individually.
Definitely. I do want to also, I'm curious to know, because you also spent some time in Beijing, and you wanted to learn Mandarin.
Yes.
Can you tell me about your experience there in Beijing?
Well, are you
nervous laugh?
Are you going to?
I might test your Mandarin. My Mandarin's not great either.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I speak it at home, and that's the only time I really speak it. But I do feel like every time I go back to China.
Go. Let's try.
Oh, here we go.
You want to try?
Oh my God, here we go.
你的普通话怎么样？
怎么样？还可以，
还可以哈，
我可以聊天，
可以聊天，
Nice.
一点点。
点点。Okay, and then let me think. God, now you're putting me on the spot. I'm nervous now. 那你去 and for the listeners, we'll put subtitles in.
No, the subtitles will have broken English. Because we've got broken Chinese going on.
That's right. 那你去了北京去了多久？
半年。
半年，然后你去半年是学什么？
学汉语。
汉语 ，OK。那你这个想去北京的这个原因是什么？
原因是什么意思？哇。
All right, back to English.
Okay, back to English.
So I wanted to know also, like, what was the reason for deciding to go back to China and learn Mandarin?
2 parts. I was raised in a very controlling household under my mother, and I understand why. And so when I hit my 20s, I just wanted to break away and out of the clutches of her world. And so I convinced her that I wanted to study Mandarin in Beijing. Actually, no, Mandarin in general. And she said, you should go to Beijing. It's the most purest Mandarin, right? With the accent and all that stuff. Yeah. And I wanted to go to Taiwan because that's where all the fun,
all the pop
kids,
culture was there.
All the fun programs were. But no, I had to go to Beijing. So I spent 6 months in Yuan Xueyan. And it was a lot of fun. I got to basically be myself and spread my wings, but also, really improved my Mandarin to the point where I would go and bargain in the local markets.
Wow.
And I remember one time I had a language partner. Everyone has a language partner. And she took me to a pearl market to buy pearls, necklaces. And so Sunny and I went along, and then I was bargaining, and she's like, wow, you can really haggle with them. And I got a really good price, and I made sure they didn't give me the dodgy quality. And so I got to that level where I was just really fluent. And I remember when I was walking through, because I was quite tall compared to the rest of them, and they'd look at me and go, they knew I was Chinese, but they'll look at me and ask, are you an athlete?
Oh, that was the default question.
Yeah, that was a default question. Like, because I'm not a petite Asian. I would say I'm an Amazon Asian. Right? I used to go out with all my Asian friends, and one photo we stood in a line, and I was at the one end, and then all my itty bitty friends would line up right. And look, here's a bit off track, but you know how there used to be R&B clubs in the city where all the Asians hung out, right? This is a long time ago.
Well, that's still around, I think.
Somewhere. And so we'd walk through the city in a whole pack of us, me, the Amazon, my itty bitty friends, and then you'd get these idiot boys would go say something stupidly Asian towards you, and so every time that happened, we all just turned around and went, and it threw them off. They were like, "What the?"
Don't want to go near them.
You have to do the action too. We do the
Cover your mouth.
I think my friends and I used to do that as well.
Yeah, they were just like, "What?"
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a bit of fun.
Going back to Beijing.
Going back to Beijing.
Back to China. Yes. So no, that was a lot of fun. 6 months, and all these international people, like lots of Japanese, lots of Asians from other countries, descended in Beijing. And it was a lovely cultural experience as well. So lots of really good friends. But yeah.
So you were saying the main reason was because you actually wanted to get away from the clutches of your mum. So it wasn't necessarily like I'm sure there was. I mean,
the second reason was to learn.
Yeah.
Yeah. But really, number one, 80% of the decision was to get away from my mum.
I feel like a lot of Asian daughters do that, where they find a workaround to do something that'll still impress their parents, but also it's to get out of something as well. Yeah, it's escape.
It is. That's the strategizing.
Yeah.
And you do it with your siblings as well.
Oh, 100%.
You know, my brother and I used to like campaign together. So like if he had some party he wanted to go to, or if I had some occasion I wanted to go to, we'd start like massaging my mum. You know.
Weeks in advance.
Weeks in advance, and do good things so she's in a good mood, you know. And then we would say it, and then the other one would help.
Yep.
Right? And so it would, we would carried it through. So it was hilarious. We used to manage my mother. I think we still do in a little way. But yeah, it's just I think it's an ethnic thing. I think Indians have the same thing too, and all ethnics have this.
Yeah, I remember I used to have to do it I wouldn't say my parents were particularly strict, but they definitely had a perception of going out at night particularly and having to be home by a certain time.
Yeah.
And like back in the day, I remember, because all we would do is, if it's not going out to the club, we'd be at karaoke at 3 a.m. in the morning. And I'd always get this phone call at 2 a.m. Mum's half asleep, just going, "Where are you?" Like she'd always like know that I'm out and saying, "Oh, you've got to come home." Like that. She never, stopped me from going out, but it was definitely much harder to be able to stay out, later
then you feel bad as well that they're up at night calling you, asking where you are.
One of those things, they go up for their middle of the night pee break and they're like, "I better check. No one's home yet. The car's not on the driveway." And that was the thing. So I don't know if that was the same for you guys.
100%. I'll tell you a story. So every time I went out and my mum would say, "What time you come?" It'd be like this, "What time you come home?" And I'd be like, 10. And she'd be like, "Make sure you come home at 10, blah, blah, blah." I'm like, okay. So then I always have my friend pick me up, and she liked my friend Jason. So I said, "I'm going with Jason." She's like, "Okay, you can go with Jason." So then Jason and I would go out and hit the town. This is in Brisbane. We wouldn't come home at 10. So at 10:01.
Straight on it.
Where are
12
you?
missed calls.
It starts off softly. "Hi, where are you?"
Yeah.
And then I ignored those calls. And then 10. "Where are you?" And that will continue to escalate, and to the point where by midnight it's like, "Don't come home."
Stay out.
"I don't care. I don't love you. Don't come home.
You're not my daughter.
You're not my daughter."
Holy shit.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
And so you kind of get desensitized. You're like, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
But you still feel bad.
Yeah.
Dude, would she lecture you like the next day? 'Cause
Silent
I used
treatment.
to cop the it's a
Mine's silent treatment as well.
Oh, I don't know what's worse. I copped the 1 hour stand in the middle of the house just getting screamed at. For an hour.
Wow.
That was her
Wow.
way of doing it. Yeah. And she loves to talk. She's a school teacher. So that was her way of
Great.
venting. So I
Yeah.
kind of wish actually silent treatment would have been better.
I don't
it's
think so.
worse.
I think
No?
it's worse.
It's worse.
You don't want
so
silent
much
treatment
worse.
because you don't know how to get out of it.
Yeah.
Whereas the yelling, you're like, eventually you're going to stop yelling.
Yeah.
Yeah, get it over and done with.
You just
right?
stand there and just take it.
Meditate.
All right. Well, actually, I do have another question around. I watched your keynote, "The Making of a Dirty Lesbian in an Asian Household." I thought that was the best title because I'm in marketing. I was like, that is the best hook, the best title I've ever seen. Anyway, I found it hilarious. Not only was it a funny title, it was actually a very funny keynote as well. And I feel like sometimes with taboo topics, we often have to use humor to get the message across as well, to deal with it, right? So you essentially, you joked about, well, not joked, but you told your story about, growing up essentially being, a bit of a tomboy. You hang around with boys all the time while the girls were all sort of doing their thing. And essentially, being a lesbian, right? And so I'm really curious because we just talked about, mum being conservative and all that sort of stuff. What was that like? Because you did mention, you talked about that story whole through, but I guess if you can tell the audience in a nutshell what it was like. I know it's a very long story, but yeah, how did you deal with it?
Is the question, how did I become a lesbian? Or
No, it was more like, I think they can watch the keynote for that, but it was more like the relationship or the dynamic.
It was the wrong cereal in the morning. No, it's the coming out thing was a really tough thing, I think, for me, because I always, felt I was different, but not in a sexual way, just in general. I just thought, I'm just not the same as everyone. I don't know why. But when it came to realizing that I had attraction to girls, and then I tried to force myself to be attracted to boys, that went for a bit of a phase. But then when it was when I went to Beijing, that's when I fell in love with a girl for the first time. And so I remember both of us at the time were like, I'm not gay, I'm not, and so we were also struggling to come out. And this is like in the 2000s when there was no gay representation on TV. This was before Queer Eye for the straight guy. It was before lots of things. So for me, any sort of portrayal of lesbians in the media or public were, the bulldyke ones, the ones that were short hair, angry. I'm like, I'm not like that. I might not be gay then, right? So that was really hard. You can't be what you can't see. But eventually when you hit your like 20s and you go into I came out in my late 20s.
Wow.
But I didn't come out. I said I was bisexual, right? So, and that's when I had a conversation with my mother, because she was like, what's going on with you and that girl from
That's
Beijing?
how she noticed?
Yeah, she started to go, what's going on? Yeah. I'm like, nothing, And then when I had to have a conversation, because she was getting a bit concerned, I said that I think, I'm gay, but maybe I'm bi. just
Soften the blow a little bit.
Did you get your brother in the room?
Yeah, he was like, yeah, she is. He's like, me too.
No, he was overseas at the time.
Yeah.
And so my mother's initial reaction was really like horror, and she was more horrified at herself. She was like, like she failed. She was more like, oh, what did I do wrong? Is it because you didn't have a father by that time?
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it because I sent you to the old girls' school in Brisbane? You went to an old girls' school. They made you a
Playing back
lesbian.
everything,
Yeah. So she's like, was it because of something I didn't do right? Blah, blah, blah. So she was all like, vroom. And then it wasn't obviously to do with her, but she had her own. And then she was very protective. She was like, make sure you don't tell anybody at work, because they'll treat you bad. Or she just don't go telling anybody. So for a long time, she didn't tell anyone anything. And even my aunties and uncles, she didn't say anything. And I had moved away by then. She still lives in Brisbane. I moved to Sydney by then, so we had a little bit of space. But it wasn't until I think it was my my late 20s when I actually went, I think I'm actually gay. I'm not bisexual. I'm a Gaysian.
I've never heard
that term either. But that's a great term,
Gaysian,
yeah.
yeah. So there's so many Gaysians. So I went and had a conversation with her. And at the time, there was some opportunity to have some publicity about some other issue. And so my mother got really afraid that it was actually 60 Minutes wanted to do a story. 60 Minutes wanted to cover a story. And I asked my mother, and she got horrified that the whole world would then know her daughter's lesbian. So then she told me not to do it. And by that time, I kind of got annoyed. It was, many years of just pretending.
Yeah.
And then I felt that I had enough distance from her to feel confident to say what I wanted to say.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, but my brother was not very supportive at the time. He was sort of, you just want to be a poster for gay rights. Oh. And that really hurt.
Yeah.
And he says, she can't change, She's old. She's in her 60s at the time. She can't change. You can't just come in and do this and blah, blah. So I just felt like disowned a bit.
Yeah.
And so anyway, we had a massive fight, and that wasn't in the keynote. We had a massive fight about it, about many things. I think it was just bubbling up. Asian pressure of family stuff just exploded.
Yeah.
And I was like, I've had enough. And I said the words, I hate this family. I said the words, I hate coming back here. I don't feel like I belong. And then my mother was so upset, and my brother got so angry at me for making mum upset. And so he told me to F off and go home. And so I remember that was the weekend that Qantas was having its industrial relations dispute. And so Alan Joyce, the CEO at the time, grounded the entire fleet of planes. Do you remember that?
I remember that, yeah.
He grounded all the planes. So I couldn't get home from Brisbane to Sydney without a really expensive Virgin flight. So I ended up staying in Brisbane at a friend's house and stuff. But from that point on, I didn't speak to my mother or my brother for close to 10 years.
10 years.
And so what about now?
Now, so about a few years ago, I had the desire to reconnect with my family. And a series of things happened in my life. So I had my children. I also developed a chronic autoimmune disease. So I was critically ill with rheumatoid arthritis. And so this was in the space of a couple of years. And I felt that I just needed to address that emotional trauma that was with my family. Because all that time, I was walking around in my head saying that they rejected me. They didn't want me to be around. And so it was a very, lonely and hurtful period. And so, yeah, but on another story, I mean, I started taking up and learning about spirituality and learning about different modes of healing and going and addressing those emotional traumas that I think actually impacted my autoimmune condition. They were all signs for me to change and to make some drastic changes to how I lived my life. And so as part of that journey, I reached out to my mother. And by that time, because I had rheumatoid arthritis, I don't know if anyone's had it, but it just attacks your joints and you lose a lot of weight. So I lost 10 kilos in 6 months and I couldn't gain it back. And so I was very gaunt and tired and in pain a lot. And so when I finally reached out to my mother, I remember having a phone call with her just to see where she's at. And we had a conversation for 45 minutes and then she started going back into her old stories and spiraling down, and I felt like I was 15 again. And so I cut the conversation short and I said, I'm not here to argue with you. And she was like, well, have a good life. And that was it. Wow. So I hung up the phone and I remember I burst into tears because I was like, after all these years, nothing has changed.
Right.
So much trauma you're still holding on to.
Right. And I thought, you know what? That's it. At least I know that's where she's at. But then a couple months later, I was sitting on a beach and I had this feeling to just go and reach out to her one more time and see her in person. So I just booked a flight to Brisbane that weekend. I met up with her in a cafe and on the way up to Brisbane, I was in tears because I was anxious about what if I see her and she's really old and she's really frail and, all
it was
those,
like 10 years.
You hadn't seen each other for 10 years. I had children by then and all that. She wasn't part of any of that. It was quite an emotional period of time. I went there and met her at a cafe and I walked in and I think I saw her and she was just like, looks fit as a fiddle and strong as an ox and, and she took one look at me and I was very gaunt and skinny and she just went, what happened to you? And so I ended up telling her about how sick I got and she was so upset. She was like, I can't believe that this happened. I didn't know that. She turned into mother mode. So all of that stuff melted away. All of it melted away. And she was so happy to see me but also so sad that she wasn't part of my life for so long. So that was the start of us reconnecting. And I think I later had a conversation with a shaman because I got into shamanism. I've got 2 shamans. Why have one? We can have 2.
Yeah.
Greedy. So I remember having a conversation with a shaman and she said to me, the reason why you have not been connected to your family for 10 years is because we needed to put them aside so you can do your thing. And I thought, that makes a lot of sense because all this time I had this narrative that I was rejected by my family, but really it was meant to sort of give me space.
Yeah.
Because I don't think I could be who I am now without that space.
You talk about spreading your wings and you really had to after that point.
You just need that space. You need their time away. So it's like the hero's journey. You know, you go on this big quest and then you
trials
go
and
off
tribulations.
trials and tribulations. You meet people who help you, and then you learn something and you realize you've got some sort of power, and then you come back and you bring it to the world. It's that sort of, I feel like I'm doing this hero's journey life at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because I know it's a very vulnerable thing as well, right? Because, you know, us Asians, we grapple with our emotions in a lot of different ways, but also to talk so candidly about, you know, some of the issues that you've had, and it's pretty fresh as well. Like, it's not as if this was 20 years back and now you're just telling that story now. So I really appreciate that as well. I've had my own fair share of mental health, or I would call it chronic conditions, around generalized anxiety disorder, and just, you don't know what sets you off. Something just triggers and you feel there's this malaise and you feel terrible. And I did a lot of exploration around how, you know, physical health manifests as a result of really terrible mental health. So do you feel like all of that, I guess the family relations and all that stuff happening, maybe you going out doing your own thing, do you think it maybe would have contributed to the autoimmune, you know, like with rheumatoid arthritis and all that?
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason why there's no cure for autoimmune, because they don't know how it starts. And I think that just through all of the experiences that I've had and learning about all these different modes of healing and looking after yourself, that, the body does have its own knowledge and its IQ, and it retains and stores trauma. And it might not even be yours. It could be from your past lives and your past generations. And so your body's response to telling you that something needs to be addressed is through like an autoimmune condition. And the interesting thing is that it started, well, I always like symbolism. Like, I analyze everything. I go, I connect dots. And so when there's something symbolic or coincidental, I pay attention. So with my rheumatoid arthritis, it started with my middle finger on my right hand here. And so it'd flare every time I had Japanese whiskey. It would like impregnate a joint there.
Okay.
And I used to call it my Japanese whiskey finger. So it came up and down, and then it spread. So this finger is actually linked to, I think, the meridian that connects to your pericardium, which is your heart, the protector of your heart. Now, my issue was I had a broken heart. I had lots of healing to do in my heart with all the stories that I had. So, it's connected.
Yeah, I get that. So, what sort of healing did you explore that really helped you?
So I tried everything. So I had crystal healing, crystal meditation. I did CBD oil. I got some CBD off the street from some person with cash in a paper bag. I've tried, cell food drops. I've tried acupuncture. I've tried physio. I tried chiro, osteo, psychology. I even went to a psychiatry at one point in time. I tried so many singing bowls, shamanism, everything. Obviously changing my diet,
Usual,
medications, all this stuff. And so I don't know what in particular did it. I think it was a combination of all the things, but also too, I started addressing some of those things that were upsetting me that I didn't realize. I actually did hypnotherapy, and I did guided meditation through hypnosis to talk to your soul, a whole bunch of stuff. Wow. There is so much out there that is beyond just Western medicine that I've been very interested in and I've experienced. So I'm a big fan in blending things. It's no one thing is a great thing.
Yeah, of course.
It's a nice equilibrium if you can get things that work for you. So I think that's why I had to experience that, to learn all this, because it actually, I feel a lot more balanced and healthy and aligned spiritually and physically, which makes me more effective in what I'm here to do on earth.
That's so interesting, because I felt I exhausted every Western medicine. I did every test under the sun. I talk about how I actually did about 8 endoscopies in the space of 12 months because they felt it was a gut issue. And I had this thing called eosinophilic esophagitis, which was this, I couldn't even, I can pronounce it now, but I couldn't at the time, EOE. And it was this thing where they said you were having an allergic reaction in your esophagus because of something you're eating. And I was like, I've never been allergic to a single thing in my life. And all of a sudden I have this condition. It was during a very stressful time. And so they put me on an elimination diet. They said, you got to just go back to basics, whole foods and whatever. And you had to add them back in. So each endoscopy was adding back in a food group. And the crazy thing was at the end of it, my gastroenterologist said, you're good. You don't have an allergy. And it was around the time where I never felt better. I was fitter. I was like exercising and all that sort of stuff. So it's crazy just how I feel like how little Western medicine actually knows sometimes. And I agree with you where you have to have a combination of a few different, even alternatives to see what works. And so it's crazy how I talk to a lot of people and everyone goes through some form of this journey, like just trying to heal themselves. And I think a lot of it has to do with trauma and mental health and that sort of stuff as well. Like we've only just scratched the surface. Yeah.
Western medicine as well just always constantly feels so invasive. Like what is it? Those internal, and then like you said, the body keeps count of every traumatic event that happens, whether or not it's yours or someone else's. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing a story as well.
Oh, it's so beyond data.
But this is the whole, I mean, this podcast itself, I think it's really important because certainly for not just like younger people, but, you know, I was dealing with this in my late 20s. And so, you know, a lot of us, you know, who grew up, like I was born in 89, so I can say I grew up in the 80s as well. You just don't grow up with learning this sort of stuff. No one teaches you this stuff and we have to figure it out for ourselves. Yeah. And the other thing about sort of doing this podcast was to sort of set up like a really strong independent voice for Asians, particularly, you know, we've touched on when we had a chat around, you know, the prevalence of how Anglo media is here. So what are I know you've been on like every major media outlet, whether it's quoted or been on it. What are your general thoughts on, you know, how media is in Australia when it comes to, you know, Asian Australian topics?
Yeah, you can't help but notice that the major news brands and outlets are still very Anglo and Aryan Anglo almost. And that's a shame given how we, you know, Australia is so multicultural.
Yeah.
My assessment, it's only just from my experience during the last election media coverage, is that the decisions that are made higher up are held by a very small, tight group of people that I suspect are men that are white that want to maintain their control. And so I say that because anecdotally from talking to people in media who say that, but also my experience in when I was trying to showcase some of these insights that I've been uncovering on the election, some were quite controversial and they didn't want to run it. That to me, in terms of media in this country, we're seeing bias in the media, particularly in this last election coverage. We're also seeing the hold, you know, of certain people right at the top. And so I don't think it's a good thing. And so, however, I believe that their power and influence is eroding. I think that the fact that, you know, they're blatantly biased now, they've lost trust. So what happens? People find other ways to find news, to get entertained, etc. So you've got fringe media, fringe platforms, you've got open source platforms now, you can serve content, whatever. It's a lot more democratized that way. So I see in terms of news and media, the same evolution as what we've seen in music and digital streaming for entertainment, right? So back in the day, you know, your H&Ms and your Sony Musics and your Universals dictated what we listened to and what became a hit. Now you've got music that you can listen to from wherever that we're exposed to through platforms, you know, that are free streaming. So I see that with news anyway. It's already happening with social media. So their model's already dying. They're getting rid of all their journalists anyway, which is a shame. But there are other ways in which, like the likes of yourselves, can create your own tribes and platforms, and you will attract people who trust and enjoy your content. Simple as that. Like if you serve people, they will come and, you know, meet you halfway. So yeah, I don't think that this the media business in this country is sustainable at all. Particularly if you've got a large number of voices in the mainstream media held by two voices who are essentially the same. So there's no diversity there.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I'm hoping to help develop more localized or community-based or democratized voices because there is definitely a need in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, obviously, drawing from, like you just talked about what you're seeing and trends and that sort of stuff as well, what do you see in terms of trends when it comes to Asian Australians in general? I know that's a really loaded question, but are there any sort of things that immediately pop to mind when you're like Asian Australians in Australia? What do you think is going to happen, in the next few years?
Okay, so can we compartmentalize this? Is this fresh off the boat Asians or is this ABC Asians?
It's a good question. I would probably say a bit of both, but if I were to pick it, because selfishly I'm in an ABC, I'd be really interested in sort of second generation. Our parents came here, we grew up here. There's obviously a very different mindset when it comes to how we approach professional, personal life, the whole thing, right? And so whether it's, politics and business and all sorts of stuff, I'm just curious if there's like a highlights reel of, what you're seeing on your side, but I'm happy to go down any rabbit hole that you feel like is interesting to share.
Well, this is not based on any data analysis. This is based on N=1 observations of the world. However, I do know that in terms of all ethnicities, there are bogan ethnicities. So you get bogan Asians, bogan Indians, bogan Wogs.
Yep.
Right? So that's the Australian culture fusing with the ethnic culture, right? And so with the Asian Australians, like our generation, we have been – it's difficult because we're the first to pick and choose the best parts of both cultures. And I know that for a long time I felt guilty rejecting parts of my culture. Right? We all felt that way. It's like you go back to Hong Kong, you go back to China, you go, I don't really feel at home here.
Yeah.
My skin literally is like itchy from the air and I don't feel affinity with these people, but I feel affinity with these white people. Who am I? Right? And then you get over that because you kind of, Australianize. And so I think we're in this beautiful place where we get the luxury of picking and making your bento box. Of culture. So for my children, they're half. So I give them what I feel is the best of Eastern and Western. And I think that's a very healthy thing. So, but also too, with Australian Asians are quite evolved, I would say, because we have the mixes of two, and also we are growing up now in a world that's far different to when we first arrived 30 years ago or 40 years ago, right? The world was so different. Australia was very different. So I'm actually really hopeful that we're going to see a lot more Asian Australian representation across industry and on TV, etc. Because it's time. There's so many of us.
Yeah.
And we all have our contribution. So I feel like the Asians and the Wogs have really assimilated in Australia. It's now it's like the African nations that find it difficult, and also the Indians is the next wave coming through.
Next wave of migrants.
But it's just a generational evolution thing.
Yeah, and I think definitely the Asians are now essentially, particularly I feel like in the last 10 years, we're essentially just like you say with the Wogs, like with a fabric of, Australianism. Like it's just when people think of it, they think of the Asians as well. And I think that's a really proud thing to have. But I think we're also geographically in a very unique position because being so close to Asia, obviously big trading partners, and there's so much influence coming from Asia here as opposed to maybe say Europe. Because I remember traveling to Europe, and whilst they do have Asian populations outside of maybe just London, it's a very just a very small flavor of Asian, right? And whereas you come here and you get like everything, whether it's
an abundance.
Food, culture, that's a massive abundance. And I remember coming back and I felt very lucky. I was like, I get to be in a country where I could experience many, many different types of cultures, whether it's Asian or non-Asian. And I guess where I'm leading to this as well is like, there's the relationship, and not to sort of go too political, but the relationship between Australia and China has been very difficult, the last few years because of, the most recent government. What do you feel like you think, well, what do you hope for, I guess, would happen in the next few years now that we've got a new government, China being our largest trading partner? Where do you see that going?
Well, when I can talk to some research we've done in that field in relation to the relationship between China and Australia. When we're looking at migration and international student flows, we're trying to understand, from major source nations, what do they think about Australia? So China was one market that we looked at. So the relationship is actually quite strong at the grassroots level. So, for example, relationships between schools and councils and governments and high schools and universities, one-to-one, very strong, right? And that's over years of fostering this relationship. But then at the time, we had the previous government and the narrative was actually very adversarial, right? So there's recognition of that from China and in Australia that whilst the parents are fighting and bickering, the kids are still playing well with each other.
Yeah.
So I feel quite hopeful that just because the top were, having little verbal stoushes with each other, that fundamentally it's about relationship, and particularly in Eastern culture, it's relationship driven.
Yes.
Right? So it's guanxi. So that stuff you build over time. You can't just lose just by some words from someone who's in government who could be gone tomorrow.
Yep.
So I'm very hopeful that there is enough connections across industry and across people to people that will be okay. Now, with this new government, it's pleasing to see that, they are taking a slightly different stance in the dialogue and also just being more cooperative, at least having that regional sort of more awareness that we are in this region. We're not actually the 53rd state of the United States of America. That was quite frustrating having that playbook that we would have to, it was just like, did everyone see through that? Everyone saw through that, right? Yeah. So we do have a US election coming up soon. We've got the midterms in November. So again, there's going to be some jockeying, but my view is it's hopeful. At the end of the day, if you talk to people who do business with Asia, the relationships are strong. It's just the decisions at the top that dictate certain policies, etc., that are frustrating. But I think that should be kept out of the general population discourse. I don't think we should talk about national security. I don't think we need to talk about national security issues with the general public. It is purely with the government. It's like, for example, as a parent, if my kids are scared of the boogeyman underneath the bed, I'll deal with the boogeyman. Yeah. I don't need to involve them in the boogeyman. So mummy will deal with it, leave it with me, and they just continue on with their life. They don't have to have that input and, feel the fear, anxious or whatever, because they have no control of the outcomes with this boogeyman. There is no boogeyman, but you know what I mean, right? Yeah. So I think it's been politicized too much, and that's what I don't appreciate. But I'm generally hopeful that, this election was not just a historic election for democracy, but the world has been looking at Australia in the past with, I would say, with disappointment, particularly from climate change and COP26, massive disappointment. But now they're looking at Australia again. And so, for example, previously they may not have decided to trade with us or send their kids here to study or whatever. Now it's like a fresh set of eyes, new government, the people have spoken. It's a different feeling. There's a lot of hope and expectation.
Absolutely.
That's what I'm seeing.
It's
so
like a new shift.
I'm actually really excited about the next couple of years, despite everything feeling scary. But it's only scary if you let it in. And if you just switch off the news, which we know are losing their power, they're going to lose their power quickly. Don't pay attention to that stuff, because there's a lot of really wholesome stuff on the ground.
Yeah. And you sort of have to almost see it, right? So if you spend only your time seeing mainstream media, you do get that sort of level of anxiety and loss of hope. And I've never been a really sort of political person, but it was like for the first time this particular election, probably because I was just so fed up of like the dialogue and the rhetoric of what was happening in the last few years. Like it was so amplified. I don't know if it was just because of the internet, social media and everything, and Twitter, and or if it was just like I was just consuming more news, but it became very actually annoying and frustrating just to see that. And so for the first time I was like, as you mentioned, we can see how powerful democracy can be around making sure that we can influence what sort of change we want to see as well. And I'm the same. I'm super hopeful to see how that pans out, because I think certainly as an Asian, being in the Asia Pacific, it's like, why would you try and necessarily just put yourself down as the 53rd state of the US, right? Who sits on the other side of the globe, when you should be looking at who's your next door neighbor as well. And so, you know, I want to segue that into a little bit around, you know, one of the things that you are really passionate about and you want to sort of touch on is like, what is happiness and success? Because you obviously have shared your stories about not only family, professional, all this sort of stuff. I'm sure you would have had a lot of learnings and thinking and wisdom around, you know, these two things. I mean, again, it's a loaded question. Like, how do you define happiness? How do you define success? But I'm just curious how you would want to take this conversation and what sort of message you'd want to give for these two things.
I think happiness is something that we don't strive for. It's something that you should feel now, like you're happy now. It's not something you chase. So very, very simple things can make you realize how fortunate and happy you are. And just like I started adopting that a few years ago when I went through my doldrums. I was like, how can you shift your mindset? The easiest thing is actually to you know, nominate 3 things you're grateful for every day. It could be the smallest thing. So it's like bringing it back to the simple joys and connecting back to nature, for example. Like, what a beautiful day it is today. Oh my goodness, that flower is just so gorgeous. Oh, look at that bee flying around. It's just like bringing it back to joy, right? So in a way, when you think about what makes me happy, it's that I think you have to take control of your own happiness, but it's not something you chase. You are happy now. You can find happiness if you're looking for it, and it becomes a habit. And the next thing you know, it just shifts your mindset. It helped with my mindset. And success is really, it's how you want to define success. The more that you try to, you know, it starts with understanding who you are. Know thyself is the most important thing. So success is if you're making yourself happy, if you're doing the things that you are born to do. So know thyself is probably the biggest piece of work that you need to do as an individual, no matter what age. I think probably by your 20s and 30s, you want to figure out yourself, which means what's my God's given talent, which means what can I do in my sleep better than 1,000 people easily, hands down, right? What makes me passionate, which means, you know, what gets me fired up, what lights my soul. You know, they could be the same thing, could not be different, the same thing. And the third thing is, well, what's something that I can combine these two things that is a need for the world that people would want? Then you have, you know, a purpose. And so it's not easy to find those things and answer that. But once you do, then success builds from that, because then all of a sudden you're angled around those 3 things, and it's not so much about, you know, how big your house is, how much money you earn, what car you drive, you know, etc., which we all fell into, right? Which is why I chose banking. I actually didn't enjoy it, but I earned way too much money at a young age, and that's what I thought made me happy, but it didn't make me happy at all. If I really followed my passion, I would have been a performer.
Oh.
Yeah, a performer.
Well, you really want to, and I remember reading it somewhere, you really would love to just be traveling around and speaking and, you know, inspiring people. So is that still, you know, what you want to do? Yeah.
It's funny. Ever since I was younger, I was quite, people used to say to me, oh, why don't you become a comedian? You're so funny. And I'm like, oh, no, I don't really like, you know, again, I would watch a comedian on stage, and you get 2 types of comedians. The angry ones that yell and swear and make jokes. And I'm like, I'm not really like that. Or the other ones that are just sort of like, they have shitty lives and they complain about their shitty lives, right? And I'm like, I'm not like that either. So I never found a way to engage in comedy, but I always performed and I always liked to speak. So now I'm at this position where things have sort of finally come together.
Yeah.
And I'm in my 40s, and so I can talk on stage about material that's interesting using my God's gifts talents, and it's serving the world, and I get to add my splash of humour to it.
Yeah.
So that's my way of performing and speaking with a bit of comedy and a bit of wit. So I'd love to just travel the world, because I love travelling and seeing cultures and meeting people, and just helping them shift their perspective of things, open their minds, inspire them from whatever, you know, droplets of wisdom I have collected along the way.
Where did you get your, did you do any formal training for speaking, any of that?
Well, I didn't go to the Juilliard School of Speaking. I think I've always played around with speaking and practicing in front of the mirror and stuff. I remember one time when we were probably, 6 or 7, my mother would like lock my brother and I in a room, not lock, but she'd close the door. There was a study desk, a circular one, and she'd put a little tape recorder in the middle and press record. And so my brother and I she goes, not allowed to touch it. So we'd just sit at the side of the table and talk to it like a radio show.
Wow.
And so that's what we did. And she'd pop her head in every now and again and go, how you going? And we're like, we're still going. And, you know, at that age, we were talking about farts and we were talking about picking our noses and stuff. We made a show about it. We'd giggle to each other. But I've always had that sort of desire to communicate. But in terms of formal training, I have had some speaker coaching, but also training is in the field. You know, the best training is actually getting out there and doing it. And so it's like busking, you know, like you just have to get out there and it's a contact sport.
Yeah. It's like going to the gym, right?
Yeah.
It's all a repetition and it's practice, right?
The more you do, the better you get at it.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's hard because you get, you know, smashed in the face sometimes. You completely bomb sometimes, but, you know.
You got to pick yourself up.
Pick yourself up.
We've got a lot of younger people and younger professionals listening to this podcast as well. We just wanted to ask you, for those who are also looking to pursue a similar career or trying to pivot across their career as well, what kind of advice would you give them?
If you're in your 20s, it's about skill accumulation and getting experience. So if you've got the ability to work really hard, which means long hours, like in banking, you probably can accelerate your learning. That's what I would say. Because you don't have responsibilities, you don't have a lot of energy and all that sort of stuff. So skill accumulation. Always have a trade, which means that you know, everyone comes out with a trade. You're either a lawyer or an accountant or a finance person or a speaker or a trade, you know, not something of value, you know, don't be an influencer. They're just flash in the pan things. You need a trade because you can always rely on that trade. So I studied economics, but I never became an economist. I call myself an economist now because it's relevant to my career. That's my trade. I'm also an accountant and a finance person. So I've got a couple of trades. But without a trade, you're basically nothing. You could be a plumber as a trade. You could be a whatever as a trade, but you've got to have a trade, a skill, a capability. So build that as fast as you can in your 20s, which means that get as much exposure as you can. And don't need to stay too long in any one place or any one role. If you're starting to feel like you're getting on top of it, that's if you're ambitious. Not everyone's ambitious, you know. But if you really want to pursue as much acceleration, skill accumulation, also start building your networks, your 360 networks, people beside you, your peers, people below you and people above you. And so what I mean by that is nurture and seek out relationships, learn how to connect with people, because at the end of the day, it's all about people. So these relationships serve you throughout your life. I've got people now who are my clients that I've known from 20 years ago, right? When I was doing something completely different. But, you know, you build your reputation, you nurture your reputation. And I think the third thing is it's okay if you chop and change. I've chopped and changed so many times, but it's about skill accumulation. So don't be too hard on yourself. And if you're not learning, if you're not enjoying it, move on.
Yeah. I think that's
Very wise words.
Yeah, that's a really good note to end
and
on.
I give you permission.
And that's important as well.
It's true. Sometimes you feel like you don't have permission.
Yeah.
So I'm saying to you now, like, you know, give it a go. You'd rather be brave and give it a go than, you know, think at night and wonder with regret, I should have, could have, would have.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's the validation that some people need as well and the reassurance.
You have permission.
Yeah.
Have permission to give it a go.
Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today and sharing your
I really
stories.
enjoyed this one.
I
Yeah,
really,
this was
really enjoyed
amazing.
this one. Where can we find you online to find out more about you and your business as well?
Easy thing is to Google.
Yes.
You are who Google says you are. But my personal website's probably good, elisachoy.com. Also my business website, mavendata.co. I've got a YouTube channel. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always there. Twitter, I'm starting, but it's a different beast, Twitter. It's mean.
Yeah.
They're really mean on Twitter.
Sharp and snappy.
It's free for all.
It's really, I'm like, I don't like being in the piranha waters. It's just horrible. And Insta as well, I have a bit of fun. So, but I'm generally pretty open to any inquiries. And I appreciate your having me come on your show. Thank you very much.
Oh, likewise.
Questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Level Asian podcast. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a 5-star review if you enjoyed the episode. And why not share it with friends and family who might enjoy it too? Also, make sure you head over to levelasianpodcast.com to join our email list and to receive the latest updates and get notified when the next episode drops. If you know a great guest we should feature, email us at contact@levelasianpodcast.com or DM us on our socials in the show notes. Catch you on the next episode.